Exodus 4:24 through 26 is among the Bible's strangest passages. Following his encounter with God at the burning bush, Moses was given the honorable mandate to approach Pharaoh and act as God's representative in the process of reclaiming his people. He had been called, given extraordinary powers, and was now starting to go out to carry out his duty. We are unprepared for what followed. At a lodging place on the way, the Lord met him and sought to put him to death. Then Zapora took a flint and cut off her son's foreskin and touched Moses' feet with it, and said, "Surely you are a bridegroom of blood to me." So he let him alone. It was then that she said, "a bridegroom of blood," because of the circumcision. Exodus 4:24 through 26. It is a strange passage. I don't think there's anything comparable in the entire Bible. It is of utmost significance, drawing our attention to God's covenant promise in a stunning and enduring manner. This is the history in a nutshell. Moses was born and raised in Pharaoh's family, but through faith he joined the children of Israel, who were Pharaoh's slaves. Hebrews 11:24 through 26. Moses murdered an Egyptian because he believed the moment had arrived to free Israel from servitude. Acts 7:23 through 25. Although Moses believed that the moment had come for the release of Israel, it was his chosen moment, not God's. He was consequently compelled to leave Egypt and seek out a new home where he would be safe. He discovered this location at Jethro's residence in the Sinai Peninsula. He remained there for 40 years, taking care of Jethro's sheep. He married Zapora, Jethro's daughter, during this time, and the couple bore a son. Exodus 2:16 through 22. But now was the right time for God to deliver his people. He therefore sent Moses to Egypt to free Israel. The incident mentioned in the text happened while Moses was returning to Egypt. The text is unexpected and challenging to understand due to the language's obscurity. In verse 24, for instance, it's unclear who him is. Is it Moses or Gershom, his son? The ESV adds the words Moses, but the word is not present in the Hebrew text. Therefore, we are unsure of who or what Zapora touched with Gershom's foreskin in verse 25. There are also cultural obscurities that are challenging to understand. The contrast between the Midianite practices surrounding circumcision and the Hebrew practices given to Abraham in Genesis 17 appears to be what gives the story its dramatic tension. Since we are unable to access Midianite traditions, reading Exodus 4:24 through 26 can be compared to listening to one side of a phone call. But we have a general sense of what happened. God wanted to kill Moses. Moses' wife, Zapora, used a flint knife to circumcise their son. After the procedure, Zapora touched her husband's feet with the foreskin and referred to him as a bridegroom of blood, alluding to the circumcision. At that point, the Lord let him alone. Exodus 4:26. It is likely that God in some way kidnapped Moses and his family while they were on their way from Midian to Egypt and struck him in a way that immobilized him. Following this thought, Moses is probably the him in verse 24. It's possible that Moses experienced a seizure or fell unwell without warning. The exact method of the attack is unknown. The fact that his wife Zapora recognized what was happening right away suggests that the attack was slow-moving enough for her to act in a penitent manner. This implies that it was never intended to be fatal. It served as a warning and had the desired effect. Zapora serves as the story's primary human character. The supernatural assault rendered Moses helpless, and Gershom was a young boy. It appears that Zapora and Moses had previously discussed the subject of Gershom's circumcision, given that she knew exactly what to do to placate the Lord's wrath. Here, our reconstruction is made more difficult by our incomplete knowledge of the Midianite ritual. According to many historians, the Midianites performed the ritual right before the wedding ceremony. A young man who had been betrothed would have his circumcision, after which he would rest and then marry his wife to complete the marriage. If that view is accurate, it would appear that Moses had effectively reared his son as a Midianite. He had not performed the 8-day circumcision that God had commanded Abraham and all of his offspring to perform. Genesis 21:4. Perhaps Moses had adhered to Midianite traditions out of loyalty to his father-in-law Jethro. However, the fact that God dealt personally with Zapora shows that she may have contributed to the unwarranted delay. Maybe realizing this, Zapora took the flint knife right away and circumcised Gershom, going against Midianite tradition. But with Moses paralyzed, she was forced to carry out the ritual in the manner she was accustomed to. She used the child's bloodied foreskin to mark Moses. Once more, the Hebrew text of verse 25 does not contain the term Moses. Therefore, it is up to the translators and commentators to determine whether she was grabbing Gershom's foreskin or Moses's. It would seem more reasonable to infer that the Midianite ceremony involved caressing the child. According to Douglas Stewart, Zapora touched Gershom's foreskin after she had circumcised him. One of the Hebrew synonyms for genitalia is feet, so after physically circumcising Gershom, she promptly touched his genitalia with the foreskin that had been cut off and murmured the right words. Following that, Zapora is heard in the ESV exclaiming, "Surely you are a bridegroom of blood to me." Exodus 4:25. However, the term bridegroom can also be translated as kinsman. Whether you translate it as bridegroom or kinsman entirely depends on whether you think she was touching the foreskin of Moses or Gershom. It appears more plausible that the Midianite ritual called for stroking the young man with the foreskin. It was a means of communicating, by this blood and through this ritual, you join and extend the family. God accepted the use of these words as proof that the action was performed in faith and obedience, and the story continued. So far as we can gather, God was threatening Moses that he would kill him because he had not circumcised his son. But the question is, why was that particular sin being condemned so harshly? Moses undoubtedly committed other transgressions, but God decided to pursue the death penalty in this particular issue about circumcision. The explanation most likely dates back to Abraham's time. God called Abram and made a covenant with him, changing Abram's name to Abraham and giving him circumcision as a symbol of the covenant. The following event was later recorded by Moses. Then God said to Abraham, "As for you, you must keep my covenant, you and your descendants after you, for the generations to come. This is my covenant with you and your descendants after you, the covenant you are to keep. Every male among you shall be circumcised. You are to undergo circumcision, and it will be the sign of covenant between me and you." God made it quite plain that every male in every household among Abraham's offspring was to be circumcised. There were to be no exceptions. "My covenant in your flesh is to be an everlasting covenant. Any uncircumcised male who has not been circumcised in the flesh will be cut off from his people. He has broken my covenant." Genesis 17:13-14. As a descendant of Abraham, Moses had undergone circumcision as well. He had not, however, circumcised his son for whatever reason. It's possible that Moses stopped acting like a Hebrew after 40 years of shepherding in Midian, or maybe he believed he was already cut off from his people, in which case he did not see the need to bother with the covenant sign. Moses was having a problem since he was heading to Egypt to save God's circumcised people from the uncircumcised Egyptians. The line between the oppressors and the slaves was clearly defined, but Moses, the leader of God's people, was erasing that line within his own family. Furthermore, Moses was to be Israel's lawgiver, and it was improper for the lawgiver to be a lawbreaker. Circumcision would be a requirement of the law. It would be hypocritical of Moses to have an uncircumcised son, and hypocrisy is never good for a leader of a country. Before Moses could effectively guide the spiritual lives of the Hebrew people, his personal life needed to be in order. Whatever the reason for Moses' disregard for such a significant ritual, his sin disqualified him from holding the position of spiritual leader. Before he could complete his assignment, the issue needed to be fixed. He had to lead by example. We are taught that to whom much is given, much is required. Jesus says in Luke 12:48, "But the one who did not know and did what deserved a beating will receive a light beating. Everyone to whom much was given, of him much will be required, and from him to whom they entrusted much, they will demand the more." The Bible tells us that leaders will be held to a much higher standard. James 3:1 says, "Not many of you should become teachers, my brothers, for you know that we who teach will be judged with greater strictness." It's not clear if Zapora's decision to forego having her son circumcised was motivated by the fact that she originated outside the covenant's lineage. She, if we may be charitable, could not comprehend the truth of God's covenant, even though her father was undoubtedly a priest and that God's worship was maintained in his household. However, Moses was aware of these facts and ought to have been punished. Moses deserved to die because he broke the agreement with God. How could the person in charge of freeing God's covenant people from slavery in Egypt be someone who had broken the agreement? Before God could use Moses as a suitable tool to lead his covenant people to Canaan, he had to fulfill his covenantal commitment. Even though God was prepared to slay him, Moses survived because God permitted repentance and forgiveness. Again, this was a lesson on faith. Zapora employed language and gestures that were more in line with Midianite traditions than with Hebrew when it came to her son's circumcision. Given the urgency of the circumstances and her husband's disability, she had few options. Nevertheless, because it was performed with humility and faith, God approved of her interpretation of the rite. Regarding the sacrament of baptism, the New Testament expresses the same perspective. According to Peter, while commenting on the analogy between our salvation and the salvation effected for and through Noah, our salvation is not simply a result of the ritual of baptism, but rather an appeal to God for a good conscience through the resurrection of Jesus Christ. 1 Peter 3:21.